Princess Anne, the Queen's only daughter, sat in the back of the vehicle. At 23 years old, she had already established herself as the most independent and no-nonsense member of the royal family. An accomplished equestrian who would later compete in the Olympics, she possessed a practical, grounded temperament that set her apart from the more ceremonial royals. Beside her sat her husband of just 5 months, Captain Mark Phillips, but a handsome army officer whom she had married the previous November. The newlyweds were still in that honeymoon phase of their marriage, living in married quarters provided by the Army at Oak Grove House in Sandhurst. The evening had begun pleasantly enough. The couple had agreed to attend a special screening of a short film titled Riding Towards Freedom, which told the story of the Riding for the Disabled Association, a charity that would become one of Princess Anne's lifelong passions. Both she and Mark had appeared in several sequences of the film, and they wanted to show their support. The screening took place at Sudbury House on Newgate Street, near Ludgate Circus, and had wrapped up by early evening. As the limousine pulled away from the venue shortly after 7:30 p.m., the royal party had no idea that elsewhere in London, a troubled young man was putting the final pieces of a deranged plan into motion. His name was Ian Ball. As a 26-year-old unemployed former hotel clerk who had convinced himself that kidnapping the princess and demanding a ransom of £2 or £3 million would solve all his problems. He had been preparing for weeks, purchasing 2 revolvers, writing ransom notes demanding money from the Queen, and even scouting locations where he might hold his royal captive. In his warped mind, he believed the government would simply pay whatever he asked, and he would escape to start a new life. Then in the front seat of the Austen Princess sat 55-year-old Alexander Callender, a trusted chauffeur who had worked in the Royal Mews for 20 years. He was a family man, married with 2 children, who took immense pride in his responsibility. Beside him sat Detective Inspector James Beaton, Princess Anne's personal protection officer. Beaton was a 30-year-old Scot from Aberdeenshire who had been assigned to protect the princess on the very day of her royal wedding, just 5 months earlier. He had recently been promoted to inspector after 11 years on the force, and he took his duties with the quiet seriousness of a man who understood that the safety of a royal person depended entirely on his vigilance. In the folding seat behind the partition, separated from the driver and Beaton, sat lady-in-waiting Rowena Brassey, completing the party of 5. The route they followed was routine. Down Fleet Street, into the Strand, across Trafalgar Square, then finally into the Mall, the grand ceremonial avenue that leads to Buckingham Palace. It was a journey they had made countless times, past the monuments and landmarks that defined royal London. The palace was less than a quarter-mile away when the night erupted into violence. As the limousine passed the turning for St. James's Palace, entering what witnesses would later describe as the darkest stretch of the Mall, a light-colored Ford Escort suddenly accelerated alongside them. The driver swerved sharply, cutting directly in front of the royal car and forcing Alexander Callender to slam on the brakes. Before anyone could fully process what was happening, a man leaped from the Escort, a gun already in his hand. He fired directly into the royal limousine, the crack of gunshots shattering the evening calm and smashing one of the rear windows into a spiderweb of broken glass. Inside the car, time seemed to slow down. Princess Anne would later describe her memories of that night as individual snapshots, frozen moments that would stay with her forever, but not necessarily in the right order. What happened next would test the courage of ordinary people and reveal that heroism does not always wear a uniform. The battle begins. James Beaton didn't hesitate. The moment the Ford Escort forced them to stop, his training kicked in, overriding any natural instinct for self-preservation. And he threw open his door and scrambled out of the limousine, running around the front of the vehicle to position himself between the gunman and the princess. What he found when he reached the rear door chilled him to the bone. Ian Ball stood there, his face a mask of desperate determination, his hand reaching for the door handle. When he saw the protection officer approaching, he didn't run. Instead, he raised his pistol and fired directly at Beaton's chest. The bullet struck home, a searing pain that would have dropped most men. But Beaton was made of sterner stuff. Despite the wound, he managed to draw his own weapon and return fire. His shot went wide, the chaos of the moment and the shock of being hit throwing off his aim. He pulled the trigger again, but this time, instead of a report, there was only a sickening click. His gun had jammed. Meanwhile, Ian Ball had managed to wrench open the rear door of the limousine. Inside, Princess Anne sat in the back seat. In her blue velvet dress, a favorite she had worn when leaving for her honeymoon, suddenly seeming like the flimsiest protection against the reality of a gunman reaching for her. Ball grabbed her by the arm, his grip desperate and strong. "Please get out of the car," he demanded, his voice carrying an edge of panic that made him all the more dangerous. But Ball had not accounted for Captain Mark Phillips. The Army officer, trained to keep a cool head under pressure, had a firm hold on his wife's other arm. What followed was a bizarre and terrifying tug-of-war, a human chain with the princess as the prize. Mark Phillips pulled with all his strength, refusing to let go of his wife of 5 months. For a few agonizing seconds, Anne was the rope in a struggle between her husband and her would-be kidnapper. Finally, Mark's strength and determination won out. He pulled her back into the car and managed to slam the door shut, but not before Ball's grip had ripped the sleeve of Anne's blue velvet dress nearly off. The dress she had worn on her honeymoon was now torn and ruined, a small casualty in a much larger war. In the front seat, Alexander Calendar remained behind the wheel, the engine still running. Everything had happened in mere seconds, a blur of violence that his mind was still processing. Ball noticed him and shouted an order to turn off the engine and stay where he was. But Calendar, a man who had served the royal family for 2 decades, was not about to take orders from a gunman. He began to open his door, intending to intervene. Ball saw the movement and reacted instantly. He raised his pistol and fired at point-blank range, the bullet slamming into Calendar's chest. The chauffeur slumped back in his seat, blood spreading across his uniform, but he was still alive. He would later recall that at first, he didn't even realize he had been shot. It didn't sound like the guns on television. Then the pain hit, and he murmured, almost to himself, "Good God, I've been shot." Inside the car, Rowena Brassey had acted on pure instinct. She opened the door on the opposite side and crawled out, crouching low against the vehicle, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She would later describe the surreal quality of the moment. The gunshots didn't sound like gunshots at all, lacking the dramatic crack she expected from television and movies. They were duller, more final, and infinitely more terrifying. Princess Anne, remarkably, remained calm. Her equestrian training had taught her to prepare for the unexpected, to keep her wits when a 1,000-pound animal decided to bolt. She applied that same discipline now, her voice steady as she addressed the man who was trying to steal her life. She asked him, in a tone that was almost conversational, what he wanted her for. Ball's response revealed the sheer madness of his plan. "I'll get a couple of million." The answer was so absurd, so divorced from reality, that it might have been funny under different circumstances. Here was a lone man with a jammed gun and a stolen car, believing he could simply demand millions from the crown and walk away. But James Beaton was not finished. Though wounded in the chest, he refused to stay down. He told Mark Phillips to release the door lock so that he could kick it open and use it as a weapon against Ball. Phillips complied, and Beaton slammed his foot into the door, sending it flying outward. But Ball was too quick. He dodged, and instead of striking him, Beaton found himself exposed. Ball fired again, the bullet tearing into Beaton's hand. Still, the protection officer didn't fall. He was fighting now on pure adrenaline and stubborn Scottish pride. Then Ball fired a 3rd time. And this shot was the worst, striking Beaton in the stomach. The bullet tore through his intestines, pierced his pelvis, and lodged in the tissues of his back. The pain was unimaginable, a white-hot fire that finally brought him down. He managed to stagger out of the car and onto the pavement where he collapsed, bleeding from 3 gunshot wounds, but alive. He had done his duty. He had bought precious seconds with his own blood. The battle was far from over, but help was already on its way. Ordinary Londoners, hearing the commotion and the gunfire, were about to prove that courage is not limited to those who carry a badge. Ordinary people, extraordinary courage. 22-year-old police constable Michael Hills was on duty outside St. James's Palace when the first shots rang out. The sound carried clearly through the evening air, and Hills didn't wait for orders or backup. He ran, sprinting across the mall toward the source of the danger. When he arrived and saw the royal limousine with its shattered windows and the gunman standing nearby, he understood immediately what was happening. Without a moment's thought for his own safety, he grabbed Ian Ball by the elbow, attempting to physically restrain him. Ball spun around, saw the young policeman, and fired. The bullet struck Hills in the stomach, a devastating wound that would have sent most men to the ground screaming. But Hills, like beaten before him, refused to give up. Not even as he felt his strength draining away, he managed to activate his personal radio. His voice, strained with pain but remarkably clear, crackled over the airwaves. "There's a shooting, I've been shot." That call for help would bring reinforcements racing to the scene, but for Hills, the fight was over. He collapsed, his blood pooling on the pavement, but his message had been sent. Behind the royal limousine, a black taxi had been traveling along the mall when the incident began. And inside sat Brian McConnell, a well-known Fleet Street journalist, who had no idea that he was about to become part of the story rather than just reporting it. McConnell saw the commotion ahead, and, with the instinct of a reporter sensing a major story, he got out of the cab to investigate. When he realized what was happening, that a gunman was attempting to kidnap the Princess Anne, he didn't retreat to a safe distance to take notes. Instead, he walked directly toward Ian Ball. McConnell approached the gunman with a calmness that was almost surreal. "Look, old man," he said, using the kind of phrase that might be used to calm an upset acquaintance. "These are friends of mine. Give me the gun." It was a remarkable act of bravery. An unarmed man walking up to an armed kidnapper and asking him to surrender. But Ball was beyond reason. He turned, aimed his pistol at the journalist, and pulled the trigger. The bullet struck McConnell in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. Another innocent person had been shot, another life hanging in the balance because they had refused to stand by and do nothing. Nearby, a young dancing instructress named Samantha Scott had stopped her Mini when she saw the commotion. She ran to the royal car where she found the occupants huddled and shaken. Rowena Brassey was still crouched against the vehicle, and Princess Anne was inside, remarkably composed despite everything. And Scott opened the door and put her hand on the princess's shoulder. "Are you all right, love?" she asked, the simple endearment a testament to how class distinctions dissolve in moments of genuine crisis. Princess Anne replied sweetly, her voice steady. "I'm all right, thank you." Scott then turned to Mark Phillips and asked if he was okay. "I'm fine, thank you," he responded, the polite formalities of royal protocol somehow surviving even this chaos. But Ian Ball was not finished. He still had his guns, he still had his delusion, and he was still determined to take the princess. He moved toward the car again, threatening to shoot if the door wasn't opened. Inside, the situation was desperate. They had no working weapons, no way to stop him. It was at this moment that another ordinary citizen entered the fray. Ronald Russell, a former boxer, was walking past when he realized what was happening. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and punched Ian Ball with all the force he could muster. The blow connected, staggering the gunman and disrupting his focus. In that moment of confusion,